It wasn't the cancellation itself that shocked royal watchers, it was the silence that followed. Just hours before a carefully planned public appearance, Prince William's name disappeared from the schedule, leaving Queen Camilla to arrive alone. Palace aides called it routine. But inside royal circles, routine is rarely this quiet and almost never this sudden. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The event had been framed in advance as something larger than a standard appearance. Commentators had described it as a subtle display of continuity, a carefully managed image of stability at a moment when public attention on the monarchy remained unusually intense. The schedule had been published, expectations had settled, everything appeared set in place, and then, without warning and without ceremony, one name disappeared. Officially, almost nothing changed. The engagement moved forward. Statements remained brief. The language was measured, controlled, and deliberately uneventful. There was no suggestion of disagreement, no mention of concern, no indication that anything unusual had taken place. Yet that silence became the story. Because royal watchers understand something few institutions demonstrate as consistently as the monarchy. Absence is rarely interpreted as absence alone. Within hours, questions began spreading not through official channels, but through the places royal narratives tend to grow. Comment sections, insider columns, quiet remarks from correspondents who have spent years reading between carefully chosen palace words. Why alter an appearance so late? Why announce nothing more? And perhaps most importantly, why allow speculation to fill the space? Reports remained cautious. Royal correspondents avoided dramatic conclusions. Some suggested scheduling pressures. Others referenced the increasingly demanding role Prince William has carried in recent years. A few pointed toward the reality that modern royal duties no longer operate with the predictability they once did. But beneath every explanation sat the same unresolved detail, the timing. Body language commentators entered the conversation almost immediately, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. Attention shifted toward expressions, interactions, and moments that ordinarily would have passed unnoticed. Analysts revisited previous engagements. Comparisons surfaced with earlier occasions, when senior royals had stepped back unexpectedly before public events. Patterns, whether real or imagined, began connecting themselves. And that is where royal stories become difficult to control. Because once public attention moves away from what happened and toward what didn't happen, the official narrative starts competing with interpretation. What had been announced as a simple appearance slowly transformed into something else, entirely a question mark attached to a schedule. Not outrage, not scandal, something quieter, something more difficult to address. The monarchy has always understood symbolism better than explanation. Every arrival means something. Every absence invites meaning. A changed schedule becomes a headline. A delayed appearance becomes a theory. A quiet adjustment becomes an entire conversation. The event itself faded quickly. What remained was the empty space. And while palace officials maintained composure and avoided fueling speculation, observers continued asking whether this was simply practical logistics or whether the adjustment reflected pressures invisible to the public eye. Because cancellations inside the monarchy rarely begin at the event itself, they begin behind closed doors. Long before cameras arrived, reports suggested discussions had already taken place inside royal residences, conversations that no official schedule would ever record. By the time the public learned that Prince William would no longer attend the engagement alongside Queen Camilla, the decision itself may already have been old news inside palace circles. That is often the misunderstood reality of royal life. Public schedules create the illusion of certainty. But behind every appearance exists another world, entirely one of revisions, competing obligations, quiet negotiations, and decisions made long before the first official statement is ever released. Royal calendars are not simply diaries. They are systems of balance. Every appearance carries layers of meaning: institutional duty, family dynamics, public expectations, and increasingly, personal realities that remain hidden from view. A single adjustment can require coordination across private offices, communications teams, security operations, and competing priorities that the public never sees, which is why observers became interested, not in the fact that plans changed, but in when they changed. Reports and commentary began circling around the unusually late timing. If the appearance had been symbolic, as many had framed it beforehand, why step back so close to the event itself? Why not alter expectations earlier? Official explanations remained measured and sparse, emphasizing normal scheduling flexibility. But restrained language often invites louder interpretation. Those who follow royal operations closely pointed out that senior royals frequently navigate overlapping responsibilities invisible to the public. Family obligations, strategic meetings, preparations connected to long-term institutional planning, unexpected private commitments. During periods of uncertainty, appearances are rarely isolated decisions, they become calculations. And periods of uncertainty have become increasingly difficult to ignore. Over recent years, the monarchy has operated under unusual pressure, balancing continuity while adapting to changing expectations, managing private realities while projecting public stability. In that environment, even ordinary scheduling decisions begin attracting extraordinary attention. Commentators started drawing comparisons to earlier moments in royal history, instances when public appearances shifted unexpectedly, only for later reporting to reveal broader circumstances unfolding behind palace walls. Not scandals, not dramatic revelations, just reminders that what appears straightforward in public often has deeper layers in private. That memory changed the way this moment was received. Royal correspondents became careful with their wording. Observers noted timing. Analysts avoided conclusions while quietly acknowledging that attention had moved away from the engagement itself. The conversation had become something else entirely. Because when information is limited, interpretation expands. Some argued the adjustment reflected practical priorities and nothing more. Others wondered whether internal considerations had outweighed symbolic optics. Neither side had evidence strong enough to settle the question, and that uncertainty became fuel. The palace remained disciplined. No dramatic clarification arrived. No visible attempt was made to redirect attention. The institution moved forward in the way it often does, by refusing to compete with speculation. But restraint has its own consequences. Because silence inside the monarchy does not eliminate, meaning it creates room for it. And slowly, almost without anyone noticing, the focus shifted away from who attended and toward what the decision itself seemed to represent. Yet the real interest wasn't the absence, it was what that absence appeared to symbolize. Royal stories are rarely told directly. They emerge in fragments, cancelled appearances, altered seating plans, and carefully chosen wording. That is what makes moments like this so difficult to interpret and so impossible to ignore. The public rarely receives a complete account of events as they unfold. Instead, royal narratives arrive in pieces. One appearance moves. One statement shortens. One expected moment quietly changes shape. On paper, each detail seems ordinary. Together, they begin to feel like something else. And whether that feeling reflects reality or projection has always been one of the monarchy's greatest unanswered questions. Royal reporting operates differently from almost every other form of public coverage. There are rarely dramatic declarations, rarely immediate explanations. Instead, there are signals, timelines, small deviations from established patterns. Correspondents speak carefully. Palace statements reveal only what they choose to reveal. The rest is assembled through interpretation. That process has existed for generations. Royal correspondents occupy a strange position in that world. They are close enough to understand protocol, but distant enough to avoid certainty. Their language reflects that balance. Sources describe, observers note, reports suggest, conversations circulate. Nothing definitive, everything deliberate. And because of that structure, audiences have learned to read royal news almost like a second language. People do not only listen to what is announced, they study what is omitted. When Prince William's cancellation became public, that familiar process accelerated immediately. Commentators revisited wording. Analysts compared schedules. Questions appeared less around the event and more around the message people believed it might carry. That distinction matters. Speculation and confirmed information are not the same thing. Even if public conversations often blur them together, confirmed information tells people what happened. Interpretation tries to explain why. Royal coverage lives in the space between those two things. That space can become powerful. Public narratives surrounding William and Camilla already exist long before moments like this appear. Every interaction, every appearance, every adjustment enters a larger story people feel they already understand. Some see continuity, others see distance. Some interpret practicality, others search for hidden meaning. The palace knows this, which is why official responses are often restrained to the point of frustration. Clarify too much and the institution appears reactive. Say too little and interpretation expands unchecked. It is an old balance and one that has defined royal communications for decades. But silence does something unusual. It invites audiences to become participants. People begin filling gaps with memory, connecting unrelated moments, turning coincidence into pattern and timing into narrative. A changed appearance becomes evidence. A delayed statement becomes symbolism. A routine adjustment begins carrying emotional weight far beyond its original meaning. And once that process starts, it becomes almost impossible to reverse. Because the monarchy has never operated purely through governance or public duty. It also operates through perception, through continuity. Through symbols, people attach meaning to whether the palace intends it or not, which raises the question that quietly lingered beneath all the discussion. If this was only scheduling, why did it feel bigger? If this was ordinary, why did so many people immediately treat it as something historic? Perhaps the answer had less to do with the event itself and more to do with something older, something already embedded in public memory. Because symbolism becomes more powerful when history already exists beneath the surface. The monarchy has spent recent years balancing continuity with change, and every unexpected moment now carries greater meaning. That may be the deeper reason moments like this no longer remain simple. A schedule adjustment once would have passed quietly through the news cycle, noticed only by devoted royal observers and forgotten within days. But the monarchy people watch today is not operating in ordinary conditions. It exists in a period shaped by transition, expectation, and the uncomfortable reality that history eventually forces every institution to confront its next chapter. That changes how every decision is received. Over recent years, public attention surrounding the royal family has shifted from ceremony toward succession, not necessarily in titles, but in presence, responsibility, and perception. Audiences have become more aware of generational movement inside the institution. Questions that once belonged to distant futures now feel closer. And with that comes a different kind of scrutiny. People no longer watch only for what royals do. They watch for what their choices seem to reveal. Family transitions have intensified that instinct. The monarchy has had to project steadiness while adapting internally to changing realities, evolving roles, and growing public expectations. Stability became the objective. Continuity became the message, but continuity often comes at a cost. Senior working royals carry an unusual burden during periods like this. Their public appearances are expected to communicate confidence while private demands remain invisible. They become symbols before they become people. Every absence invites questions. Every appearance becomes evidence of strength, weakness, alignment, or distance, even when none of those meanings were intended. And few figures carry that pressure more intensely than Prince William. His position creates expectations that extend beyond attendance at engagements or public statements. For many observers, he increasingly represents continuity and future direction at the same time. That perception means routine decisions rarely remain routine. A cancelled appearance becomes larger than logistics. It becomes interpreted as a signal. Not because people necessarily believe there is conflict, but because royal audiences have become conditioned to search for meaning inside small moments. Public interest in generational leadership has only intensified that tendency. Every interaction between senior figures is examined through questions of transition, influence, responsibility, and the shape of the monarchy years from now. That attention creates a difficult paradox. The institution works hardest to appear stable, precisely when people become most determined to detect change. And perhaps that explains why this particular moment seemed to resonate beyond the event itself. Not because of confirmed tension, not because of dramatic revelations, but because recent years have taught audiences that unexpected developments sometimes arrive quietly at first. A modified schedule, a shorter statement, a changed appearance. Small moments begin carrying emotional weight far beyond their original purpose. The populace understands that instinct and responds the way it usually does, with discipline, restraint, and refusal to narrate internal realities publicly. But restraint does not erase public curiosity. Sometimes it deepens it. Because when people sense transition, they begin assigning meaning to details that once felt ordinary. And somewhere inside all of that attention, one possibility continued lingering beneath the discussion, not loudly, but persistently. If the institution works this carefully to preserve continuity, then what makes a moment important enough to quietly change course? Which raised a larger question. Was this simply timing or something more strategic? In royal life, showing up sends a message. Sometimes not showing up sends an even louder one. That may sound dramatic, but inside the world of monarchy, presence has never been neutral. Every appearance carries meaning before a single word is spoken. Every decision about who attends, who stands where, and who appears beside whom becomes part of a language the public has learned to decode over generations. That is why moments of absence rarely remain administrative details for long. And perhaps that is why this particular cancellation refused to stay ordinary. Because there is a difference between what happens and what people believe happened. From an institutional perspective, schedules change constantly. Priorities shift, private obligations emerge. Senior royals adjust engagements for reasons that never become public and often never need to. That reality exists inside every modern institution. But monarchy occupies a different space. It functions not only through duty but through symbolism, which means explanations that feel sufficient elsewhere often feel incomplete here. When people watch royal appearances, they are rarely evaluating logistics. They are reading signals. An appearance together may suggest continuity. Separate engagements may suggest practicality. A delayed appearance may suggest caution. An absence can suggest almost anything at all. And once meaning enters the conversation, certainty begins to disappear. History has reinforced that instinct. Over time, royal watchers have seen moments initially dismissed as routine later become attached to larger stories. Schedule changes that seemed insignificant gained meaning only in retrospect. Quiet adjustments became turning points after context arrived months later. Not because absence automatically means something dramatic, but because history has taught audiences to pay attention. That creates a powerful cycle. Every new moment is measured against old memories. Media coverage reflects that reality. Headlines rarely announce conclusions outright. Instead, they ask questions. Analysts compare timelines. Commentators explore possibilities. Social discussions multiply. One article references another. One interpretation creates 10 more. Before long, the original event becomes smaller than the conversation surrounding it. And in today's media environment, that process moves faster than ever. A schedule adjustment becomes discussion. Discussion becomes theory. Theory becomes narrative. Online audiences accelerate this transformation because participation itself becomes part of the experience. People connect fragments, compare statements, revisit previous moments, build larger stories from smaller details. The result is not always accurate, but it is almost always emotionally convincing. That matters because expectations surrounding future monarchs operate differently than expectations placed on everyone else. People are not only watching Prince William as an individual. Fairly or unfairly, many are watching him as a symbol of continuity, responsibility, and eventual transition. That changes the weight attached to his decisions. A routine adjustment becomes interpreted through the lens of leadership. A cancellation becomes interpreted through the lens of meaning. And suddenly, the question is no longer whether he attended. The question becomes what people think attendance would have represented. That is where the monarchy becomes difficult to separate from storytelling, because public narratives are not built from official announcements alone. They are built from emotion, memory, expectation, and silence. And silence leaves room. Room for curiosity, room for interpretation, room for significance. Still, public fascination often reveals more than palace statements ever will. Within hours, social feeds, headlines, and commentary transformed a scheduling update into a national conversation. What began as a quiet alteration to a royal calendar no longer belonged to the palace. It had entered the public arena, the place where modern royal stories grow fastest and become hardest to contain. The shift happened almost instantly. A single question appeared first: why? Then came another, and another. Soon the conversation stopped being about attendance and became about interpretation. Online reactions moved in every direction at once. Some voices dismissed the moment entirely, arguing that schedule changes happen constantly and that public fascination was creating significance where none existed. Others pushed the opposite idea, that in royal life, especially at senior levels, appearances are too carefully managed to be dismissed as coincidence. Between those positions emerged the most powerful force of all: uncertainty. Because uncertainty invites participation. People began assembling theories from fragments. Past appearances were revisited. Old interviews resurfaced. Timelines were compared. Discussions expanded far beyond the original event. Not because anyone had definitive answers, but because unanswered questions create momentum in a way confirmed information rarely can. Royal commentators entered carefully. Their language remained familiar. Measured, cautious, deliberate. Some emphasized practical realities and reminded audiences that private obligations frequently override public plans. Others acknowledged that timing inevitably shaped perception and that symbolic events attract symbolic interpretations. Nobody claimed certainty, but certainty was no longer what people were looking for. The audience wanted context. That desire has become one of the defining tensions surrounding modern monarchy. Public figures live in a strange balance between visibility and privacy. Royal families represent institutions funded, observed, and emotionally invested in by millions, yet they also maintain boundaries the public is not invited to cross. Most of the time, those boundaries hold. But moments like this expose the pressure underneath them. Because people increasingly accept privacy in principle, while resisting silence in practice. The result is an impossible expectation. Explain enough to satisfy curiosity, but not enough to compromise dignity. Reveal enough to reassure, but not enough to create new questions. And when that balance isn't achieved, interpretation rushes in to fill the gap. International attention accelerated everything. The story expanded beyond royal observers and into wider audiences already conditioned to see monarchy through narrative. Commentators abroad approached the moment differently. Some viewed it as institutional strategy. Others framed it as evidence of shifting priorities inside the royal family. Discussions multiplied because every country projected its own expectations onto the same unanswered question. The original event almost disappeared. What remained was the reaction to it, and that reaction created its own momentum. Because speculation rarely spreads through dramatic revelations. More often it grows through repetition. One question becomes five. Five become headlines. Headlines become assumptions. Assumptions begin feeling familiar enough to resemble truth. The palace understands this cycle better than anyone, which may explain why there was no dramatic correction, no lengthy clarification, no visible effort to reclaim the narrative. Only the same disciplined restraint that has defined royal communication for generations. But restraint creates its own atmosphere, and as attention intensified, something unexpected happened. People stopped focusing on the cancellation itself. They started focusing on the silence surrounding it. But the palace's response, or lack of one, became its own story. No dramatic announcement arrived. No clarifying interview followed. Only the familiar rhythm of royal silence. And for many observers, that silence felt louder than any statement could have been. Days passed without the kind of explanation Modern audiences have grown accustomed to expecting no extended briefing, no carefully framed television appearance, no effort to reclaim headlines or redirect conversation. The engagement moved on. The calendar continued. Official communications returned to normal, but attention did not, because royal silence has never functioned as absence. It functions as strategy. For generations, the monarchy has operated on an unwritten understanding. Explain too much and the institution becomes reactive. Explain too little, and people begin constructing their own answers. Somewhere between those two extremes sits the approach the palace has protected. For decades measured restraint. That restraint frustrates people precisely because it works differently from modern public life. Most public institutions respond immediately. They clarify, correct, expand. The monarchy often does the opposite. It waits, it absorbs. It allows moments to settle, rather than competing against every interpretation. And sometimes that approach works. Sometimes silence shortens a story, but other times, silence transforms a story into something larger. Because unanswered questions behave differently than answered ones. People revisit details. They compare language. They begin treating ordinary decisions like clues. Every quiet day becomes interpreted as deliberate. Every unchanged schedule begins looking meaningful. Not because there is hidden information, but because people naturally search for patterns when explanations remain limited. That tension became impossible to ignore. Some observers argued the palace's restraint was simply tradition, doing what tradition has always done, protecting private matters from becoming public theater. Others believe the lack of detail encouraged unnecessary speculation and allowed narratives to develop unchecked. Neither side fully resolved the question. And perhaps that was the point. Royal history offers examples that keep this instinct alive. Moments once dismissed as temporary confusion later gained context through time. Other moments that attracted endless speculation eventually turned out to be exactly as ordinary as officials originally suggested. That uncertainty created the monarchy's most unusual strength: distance. The institution does not always ask to be understood immediately. It often seems willing to trade short-term clarity for long-term stability. But stability comes with a cost, because audiences today operate differently than audiences once did. Patience has shortened, access has expanded. Public curiosity moves faster than official communication. People expect updates, explanations, and transparency in real time. Royal tradition moves at another pace entirely. That collision creates friction. Curiosity asks questions. Tradition refuses urgency. And somewhere between those forces, stories begin growing. The cancellation became less important than the reaction to it. The reaction became less important than the silence surrounding it. Eventually, the silence itself became the event. Not because it confirmed anything. Not because it revealed something hidden. But because it reminded people of something they already suspected, that the monarchy still believes some things are strengthened by saying less. Whether that approach protects stability or simply deepens fascination depends entirely on who is watching. But one possibility lingered quietly beneath everything. What if the absence of explanation was never a mistake? What if allowing people to wonder achieved exactly what the institution intended? And perhaps that was always the point. In the end, the story may never be about one cancelled appearance. It may be about what people believe royal moments are meant to reveal. Because somewhere along the way, the conversation stopped being about a calendar change. It became a conversation about expectation. That may be the most enduring truth about modern monarchy. People rarely remember the event itself as much as they remember what they felt the event meant. Facts remain important. Confirmed information matters. But royal narratives have always lived in the space between reality and interpretation, the place where symbolism becomes memory and silence becomes meaning. And that distinction matters now more than ever. What was confirmed in this moment remained relatively small. A public appearance changed. Official communication stayed limited. The institution continued moving forward. Those were the observable facts. Everything else existed somewhere beyond certainty. Questions, interpretations, emotional reactions. Public narratives shaped not by announcements but by assumptions, expectations, and years of accumulated context. That does not make those reactions meaningless. It simply makes them human, because royal stories have never survived on information alone. They endure because people attach larger ideas to smaller moments. Duty, continuity, stability, change. People see symbols because monarchy itself is built on symbols. That fascination is older than headlines and stronger than explanations. One appearance becomes interpreted as confidence. One absence becomes interpreted as caution. One quiet adjustment becomes interpreted as transformation. And often, the meaning people remember years later has less to do with what happened and more to do with what they believed was happening at the time. That may explain why moments like this continue to capture attention even without dramatic revelations. Uncertainty creates narrative, not certainty. Certainty closes conversations. Uncertainty allows people to return again and again, searching for patterns, revisiting details, asking whether they missed something hidden beneath ordinary events. And perhaps that process says as much about the audience as it does about the institution itself. Because while public attention focused on one cancelled appearance, the monarchy continued doing what it has always done, moving forward without explaining every internal decision to the world. Prince William's public role will continue evolving under intense attention. Every appearance will likely carry more weight than intended. Every adjustment will attract interpretation beyond its original purpose. That burden belongs not only to individuals but to the role itself. And Queen Camilla's public duties continue under the same conditions, visible enough to symbolize continuity, private enough to remain partially unknowable. That balance may never fully satisfy modern expectations. But perhaps monarchy was never designed to satisfy curiosity. Perhaps it was designed to outlast it. Which brings this story back to where it began. Not with certainty, not with confirmation, but with a moment people could not stop trying to explain. A changed schedule, an unanswered question, a silence that became louder than the event itself. And maybe that is why these moments continue to matter, not because they reveal hidden truths, but because they reveal how much people still expect royal life to carry meaning beyond the official record. Because in royal life, absence rarely ends a story, it simply creates the space where the next chapter begins. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.